A line of grey asphalt cuts through a flat expanse of salt scrub and grey bush, running straight toward a horizon that does not bow or yield. To the left, a rusty wire fence sags on mulga posts. To the right, a surveyor's brass-capped plug sits flush in the dirt, indistinguishable from the gravel around it. Nothing moves except heat shimmer rising off bitumen. There is no sign, no marker, no shift in soil. Yet at this line, the legal authority of an entire state ends and another begins. What appears to be an empty line across an empty plain is actually one of the most precisely measured and structurally invisible borders on Earth. The remarkable thing is not that the border exists, but that it was laid down over hundreds of kilometers of arid scrub by men carrying iron chains and astronomical tables, long before anyone understood the deep geological structures beneath their boots. Why did an 1860 survey line on a flat limestone shield become the anchor for modern resource infrastructure? And how did a landscape long classified as blank turn out to be a vast, continuous human and geological record? Before modern satellite positioning, colonial cartographers in Sydney, Melbourne and Perth viewed the vast interior, the Great Victoria Desert, the Nullarbor and the Pilbara, as blank slates to be divided by straight lines of longitude and latitude. That assumption was reasonable for its time. From the saddle of an expedition, the scale presented an apparently uniform sheet of red dust and low scrub. Early authorities saw only the absence of European landmarks, missing ecological corridors, deep mineral systems, and the long-standing geographical knowledge held by First Nations peoples for tens of thousands of years. The first crack in that assumption appeared when survey lines began to buckle against the reality of the ground. The ghost town of Big Bell. Follow the red corrugated track out of Kew in Western Australia's Murchison region, and the gravel opens onto an abandoned mining town decaying silently in the scrub. This is Big Bell. Prospectors found gold here in 1904, but in 1935, Premier Mining built a planned township around a massive open-cut operation. By 1940, Big Bell held over 1,000 residents, complete with a grand two-story Italianate hotel, paved streets, and a railway branch line. The mine produced over 730,000 ounces of gold before operations ceased, and the town was dismantled in 1955. What remains today is the shell of the Big Bell Hotel, its concrete arches looming over empty streets and encroaching mulga. All of it is completely silent, and you can walk right through the ruined Grand Bar. Mount Kosciuszko hides the Murray's true alpine beginnings. You picture the Murray River starting as a broad, muddy waterway, carving through the agricultural plains of Victoria and New South Wales. Its very first drops actually seep out of a boggy alpine tarn high in the snowy mountains. It begins near Lake Kudapatamba, a cold, tea-coloured glacial lake sitting at roughly 2,048 metres above sea level on the shoulder of Mount Kosciuszko. Water leaves these high-altitude peat bogs, trickles into the Indi River, and eventually forms the main stem of the Murray, running 2,508 kilometres to its mouth at Lake Alexandrina in South Australia. In 1900, surveyor Charles Scrivener traversed these catchments, mapping water resources that would later justify both the Snowy Mountains scheme and the location of the national capital. A quiet alpine puddle feeds the primary arterial river of the nation's food bowl, the pioneer village at Sovereign Hill in Ballarat. On the outskirts of Ballarat along Victoria's Western Highway sits Sovereign Hill. Opened on November 29, 1970, and conceived by local historians decades after the original gold rush ended, it was built to exact historical scale. Timber storefronts, steam-driven stamina batteries, quartz-crushing mills, and deep underground shaft tours. In the 19th century, the surrounding district produced over 20 million ounces of gold, fueling Melbourne's rapid growth. Most assume an open-air heritage site is just relocated huts, but Sovereign Hill has operated for over 55 years as an active historical trade site, preserving goldsmithing and steam engineering beneath Mount Buninyong. A working post office operates on the main street, and real mail stamped with historical postmarks leaves it daily. The highway to the summit of Mount Wellington/Kunanyi. Most major Australian mountain peaks require days of wilderness bushwalking. Mount Wellington, known natively as Kunanyi, hands you a sealed road instead. Pinnacle Road climbs roughly 12 kilometres up the mountain's steep dolerite flank from the suburbs of Hobart. Built as a Depression-era public works project and opened in 1937, it winds through subalpine woodland before ending at the 1,270-metre summit beside a stone observation shelter. From there, the mountain reveals its iconic organ pipes, massive vertical columns of jointed dolerite formed during the Jurassic period 170 million years ago. On a clear day, the lookout opens across the Derwent Estuary and Bruny Island. It feels like a standard tourist drive until the road delivers you to a glacial scoured plateau hanging directly above an ocean port. The coldest towns in the Great Dividing Range. Leeuwenhoek in Tasmania and mainland counterparts like Shannon and Cooma look like quiet rural localities, but Bureau of Meteorology records tell a much colder story. Leeuwenhoek, sitting at an elevation of 1,057 metres on Tasmania's Central Plateau, routinely posts some of the lowest temperatures in Australia, frequently dropping below -10 degrees Celsius in winter. The trick is microtopography. The settlement sits in a shallow basin ringed by higher dolerite ridges. On clear winter nights, freezing air drains downhill off the plateau and pools in the valley bottom under strong inversions. Leeuwenhoek holds an average July minimum near zero and has recorded dips to -12.2 degrees Celsius, colder than a commercial freezer. Hydroelectric workers and fisheries staff have operated out of this frost hollow continuously since the 1920s. The craton that is still moving and buckling. People frequently lump Australia together as a dead, geologically inert slab of ancient rock. Geologists at Geoscience Australia do not. Australia is the fastest-moving continental landmass on Earth, sliding north-northeast toward Asia at approximately 7 centimeters per year due to plate tectonics. The interior is actively compressing and buckling. The Yilgarn Craton in Western Australia and the Gawler Craton in South Australia consist of Archean crust over 2.5 billion years old, yet stress from tectonic collisions causes intraplate earthquakes that crack the surface. In 1968, the Meckering earthquake ripped a 37-kilometer-long fault scarp across the wheatbelt, lifting the ground by up to 2 meters in a single night. Levant releveling surveys show that ancient structures like the Flinders Ranges are still actively being pushed upward today. The continent that is really water. From a highway lookout, Australia reads as a sun-baked continent of red dirt and dry scrub. Pull back on a bathymetric map produced by the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and the land boundary turns out to be only a fraction of the story. Australia claims an exclusive economic zone covering roughly 8.2 million square kilometres, an ocean domain larger than the 7.69 million square kilometres of the mainland itself. Inside this jurisdiction lie over 8,000 islands and vast submerged continental shelves like the Sahul Shelf and Lord Howe Rise. Line up the coastline including offshore islands, and it extends for over 59,000 kilometres, enough to circle the equator nearly 1.5 times. Most of this aquatic landscape consists of deep drowned river valleys, submerged coral reefs, and continental slopes plunging 4,000 metres into abyssal plains. Black swans on urban wetlands. You assume the call of the black swan is a mark of remote wilderness. In urban Australia, it is the background sound of an ordinary winter afternoon beside a suburban drainage basin. Australia holds the global core population of Cygnus atratus, with BirdLife Australia waterbird surveys estimating tens of thousands of breeding pairs across southern waterways. In the late 20th century, habitat loss in inland catchments combined with artificial urban wetlands caused widespread movement into coastal cities. Lakes ringed by suburban footpaths, such as Lake Monger in Perth, Albert Park Lake in Melbourne, and Lake Burley Griffin in Canberra, routinely host breeding territories and cygnets feeding in plain view of traffic. They require open water to thrive, as a black swan needs a clear runway of at least 40 meters just to take off. The regional city that hosted the Olympics. The Olympic Games are traditionally associated with major world capitals. One of the most historic venues in Southern Hemisphere sporting history sits in a regional provincial city that held fewer than 45,000 people at the time. Ballarat hosted rowing and canoeing events for the 1956 Melbourne Olympic Games on Lake Wendouree. Staging the aquatic events required transforming an ephemeral natural swamp into an international 6-lane rowing course. Local authorities deepened the basin, erected grandstands, and installed timber judge towers along the shore. The 1956 event saw international teams compete on shallow inland water, marking the first time the Olympic torch passed through an Australian regional centre. Drive past the lake today along Wendouree Parade, and the timber victory podium and historical judge towers still stand directly at the water's edge. The pale rock on the exposed summits. Climb an iconic high peak like Mount Feathertop or Mount Buller in Victoria, and the exposed rock capping the crests is pale, fine-grained, and deeply fractured. This is granite and granodiorite, crystalline igneous rock emplaced deep within the crust roughly 400 million years ago during the Lachlan orogeny. Most visitors assume Australian mountains are uniform piles of weathered sandstone and shale, but these high peaks are held up by hard, resistant igneous cores that resisted the weathering that flattened surrounding terrain. Granodiorite is dense and slow to break down. When Quaternary freeze-thaw cycles stripped thin soils from these elevated plateaus, hard crystalline rock remained exposed to high winds and icy winter blizzards. The wilderness that was clear-felled for timber, The dense mountain ash forests surrounding Marysville and the Yarra Ranges, where trees rise over 80 meters into the mist, feel completely ancient and untouched. Most of this timber was systematically cut to the ground. Commercial logging in these ranges exploded in the 1880s, feeding Melbourne's rapid urban growth with hardwood for housing. By the 1920s, dozens of timber mills operated deep in the gullies, using steam tramways to clear entire catchments. What stands today is second-growth forest, uniform in age and structure, regenerated after logging and the Black Friday bushfires of 1939. The reason these stands recovered is a legislative shift. The Victorian state government created protected water catchments and expanded national parks, halting commercial logging across key domestic water supply areas like the Thompson and Maroondah catchments. What Australia actually means on the map. The name sits proudly on every international passport, official document and globe, but its application to this specific landmass was a long historical accident. It derives from the Latin australis, meaning southern, a theoretical concept used by classical geographers to describe terra australis incognita, an imagined landmass required to balance the northern continents. Navigator Matthew Flinders actively pushed to lock the name onto this continent following his circumnavigation in HMS Investigator between 1801 and 1803. In his 1814 text, A Voyage to Terra Australis, Flinders formally proposed adopting Australia. Governor Lachlan Macquarie officially adopted the term in colonial dispatches from Sydney in 1817, and the British Admiralty endorsed it in 1824. A theoretical placeholder for an imaginary continent became locked onto 7.6 million square kilometres of real terrestrial geography. Private land planning controls in the outback. Buy a pastoral lease covering tens of thousands of hectares in outback South Australia or Western Australia, and you might assume you own the land outright to subdivide or mine as you see fit. Over 44% of the Australian landmass is held under pastoral leasehold rather than freehold title. Under state legislation, such as South Australia's Pastoral Land Management and Conservation Act, the Crown retains underlying ownership. Leaseholders buy rights only to graze livestock under strict stock density limits set by pastoral boards. A leaseholder cannot clear native vegetation or establish commercial ventures without explicit government permits. Furthermore, native title rights, recognised under the Commonwealth Native Title Act 1993, coexist over vast areas of these pastoral leases, granting traditional owners legal rights to access country, hunt, and conduct cultural ceremonies. The wild camels that established an empire. Australia holds the largest wild population of one-humped camels anywhere on Earth. Between 1860 and 1907, colonial authorities and private expeditions imported roughly 20,000 camels from India and Afghanistan, along with skilled Pashtun, Punjabi, and Baluchi handlers known as the Afghan cameleers. These camel trains became the crucial logistical backbone of inland Australia, hauling materials for the overland telegraph line, the Trans-Australian Railway, and remote pastoral stations. When motor trucks displaced animal transport in the 1920s and 1930s, thousands of camels were released into the interior. CSIRO and state wildlife studies estimate the feral population numbered hundreds of thousands before large-scale culling programs were initiated. Today, these animals roam an area covering over 3 million square kilometres, an imported transport system that rewilded an entire continent. The fire towers watching over the mountain forests. Follow a narrow, overgrown track to the top of Mount Separation or Mount Stanley in regional Victoria, and you emerge at the foot of a tall steel frame tower. It is a timber and steel fire lookout cabin from a historical system that reshaped bushfire response across the continent. In the 1920s and 1930s, following catastrophic bushfires, state forestry commissions constructed networks of elevated lookout towers across high ridges in Victoria, New South Wales, and Western Australia. An observer sat in a cramped timber cabin 30 metres above the canopy, using an Osborne firefinder to plot precise bearings on smoke plumes and radio them to regional forest officers before aircraft or satellite monitoring existed. By the 1980s, satellite imagery and aerial spotters rendered many fixed towers obsolete, though a handful remain active during extreme fire danger days. The watercraft built exclusively for the river trade. Everyone associates early Australian inland transport with steam-driven paddle-wheelers on the Murray River. On shallow tributaries like the Darling and Murrumbidgee, however, heavy lifting relied on an engineered vessel designed nowhere else on Earth, the Australian timber barge. Beginning in the 1850s, shipwrights along the Murray, such as those at Echuca and Moama, recognised that standard deep-draft hulls could not navigate unpredictable, snag-ridden inland rivers. They built flat-bottomed, double-ended barges constructed from heavy red gum timber, reaching lengths over 30 meters while drawing less than 1 meter of water when fully laden. Towed in pairs behind paddle steamers, a single barge could carry up to 1,200 bales of wool, weighing over 200 tons, down narrow channels during brief seasonal floods without grounding. The Ice Age signatures in the Alpine valleys. Camp beside Lake Albina, or Blue Lake, a deep tarn walled by granite cliffs below Mount Kosciuszko, and you are sitting inside a landscape shaped by glacial activity. During the late Pleistocene glaciation, localized ice sheets covered approximately 50 square kilometers of the main range. Glaciers ground through pre-existing stream valleys, carving steep U-shaped troughs and leaving Blue Lake at an elevation of 1,890 meters, with water depths reaching 28 meters behind a moraine dam. Polished, striated granite surfaces above the water and huge erratics scattered along ridges are clear signatures left by ice that melted roughly 15,000 years ago. Australian National University geomorphologists used cosmogenic radionuclide dating on exposed granite boulders to pinpoint the exact timing of glacier retreat, when droving was an industrial logistical lifeline. Before road trains and cattle trucks transformed outback transport, moving livestock across the continent required vast stock route networks. Along the stock route from Halls Creek to Wiluna in Western Australia, the Canning stock route, drovers moved herds across 1,800 kilometres of arid scrub and dune fields. Between 1906 and 1910, surveyor Alfred Canning mapped and constructed 51 wells along the track, tapping groundwater sources to ensure stock could travel across the Great Sandy and Gibson deserts. Historical logs held in state archives show that these routes were not wild bush tracks, but legal public corridors up to 1 kilometre wide, protected by state legislation, and mapped to link isolated inland pastoral leases with coastal markets. The quaking peat bogs hiding in the ranges. Step off a bushwalking track in the high country of the ACT or Southern Tablelands, and the ground beneath your boots can begin to flex and quiver. These are sphagnum bogs and fen wetlands, such as those found at Giannini Flats in the Brindabella Ranges. Over 6,000 years, accumulating peat moss built saturated organic soils up to 2 meters thick in high-altitude drainage lines. Ecological surveys by the CSIRO confirm that these bogs support unique cold-adapted species, including carnivorous sundews, alpine water skinks, and the endangered corroboree frog. These ecosystems act as natural water filters and sponges, capturing winter snowmelt and releasing it slowly into headwater streams like the Cotter River throughout dry summer months. The explosion that named a mountain. In 1828, explorer Thomas Mitchell climbed a prominent peak along the Liverpool Range in New South Wales and observed columns of smoke rising from fissures in the ground. Believing it to be an active volcano, colonial settlers named the feature Mount Wingan, derived from the local Wonnarua word for fire. Geological investigation by the Geological Survey of New South Wales later proved that Mount Wingan is an underground coal seam fire, the burning seam of Permian bitumenite coal, ignited naturally over 6,000 years ago, likely by lightning strikes or spontaneous combustion. The fire moves at roughly 1 meter per year, baking overlying sandstone into bright red clinker and venting hot sulfurous gases through fractured vents. It is the oldest known continuously burning coal seam on Earth. The hermit who charted the high country. In the mid-20th century, an eccentric bushman named Eileen Mitchell and local high country recluses lived in isolated timber huts across the Bogong High Plains and Snowy Mountains, documenting weather patterns and snow conditions in handwritten journals. Klaus Huneker later catalogued these remote dwellings, recording how individuals lived for decades in hand-built huts constructed from mountain ash logs and corrugated iron. They maintained detailed diaries tracking alpine flora, snow depths, and wildlife migrations long before formal scientific stations were established in the high country. When the Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric Authority began constructing dams and tunnels in the 1950s, engineers relied on these historic weather observations to verify streamflow data. The stunted forest on the exposed ridges. Reach the high ridge of Mount Sterling or Mount Borbor, and the eucalyptus trees shrink from 60-meter giants into twisted, gnarled scrub, barely waist-high. This is snow gum vegetation, Eucalyptus pauciflora, adapted to severe alpine conditions. Forest ecologists recognize that this stunted habit is a direct response to soil temperature, shallow granite soils, and heavy ice loading during winter. Roots are constrained within thin, skeletal alpine humisols that freeze during severe cold spells. A tree that reaches majestic height in sheltered valleys survives on exposed ridges only by growing laterally and staying below the severe wind threshold. These alpine woodland zones cover less than 0.1% of the continent, making them exceptionally vulnerable to fire frequency shifts. The living heritage beneath the ordinary farmland. Colonial property maps quietly implied that the volcanic plains of Western Victoria were uninhabited open pasture before European pastoralists arrived with sheep in the 1830s. They were not. Archaeological research and AIATSIS documentation show that the Gunditjmara people established an extensive aquaculture system at Budj Bim thousands of years ago. By manipulation of basalt lava flows from the Budj Bim volcano, the Gunditjmara engineered channels, stone weirs, and holding ponds across 75 square kilometers to farm and harvest short-finned eels. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal from stone fish trap channels places the construction as early as 6,600 years ago, predating the Egyptian pyramids. In 2019, Budj Bim was granted UNESCO World Heritage status, recognizing it as one of the oldest and largest aquaculture networks on Earth. The subarctic refuge in the lowland hollows. Walk along a boardwalk in the Daintree rainforest or cool temperate pockets of the Barrington Tops in New South Wales, and within minutes you step out of dry sclerophyll forest into dense, dripping Gondwanan flora. You might assume that ancient rainforest species survive only in high-altitude mountain sanctuaries. In southern and eastern Australia, the opposite is often true. The most resilient cold-climate rainforest fragments hang on down in deep, sheltered river gullies. Cold air drainage pools in these narrow valleys, maintaining high humidity and protecting Antarctic beech, Nothofagus morii, and soft tree ferns from intense bushfires. Ecologists from the Australian National University map these microclimatic refugia as critical biodiversity arcs. The Barrington Tops complex alone protects thousands of hectares of ancient Gondwanan rainforest, offering sanctuary to species that flourished when Australia was still connected to Antarctica. The pastoral station's hidden mansion. At the end of an unsealed station track in outback South Australia, the mulga opens onto an unexpected estate that is emphatically not a modest bush homestead. Sir Thomas Elder constructed Mount Shank Homestead and similar grand pastoral headquarters in the late 19th century to serve as self-contained rural empires. Designed with double brick walls, expansive verandas, stone woolsheds, and subterranean cellars, these stations operated like Gilded Age estates in the middle of semi-arid pastoral country. Behind rustic stone facades lay private gasworks, extensive staff quarters, and elaborate imported furnishings transported hundreds of kilometers by bullock team. Today, several of these grand station complexes are preserved as heritage landmarks, illustrating how 19th century pastoral magnates established urban luxury deep in the dry interior. The rarest bird hiding in the spinifex. Traverse the vast spinifex sandplains of the Great Victoria or Gibson deserts, and you may walk past one of the rarest and most elusive birds on Earth without seeing a trace. The night parrot, Pesiporus occidentalis, lives almost entirely within dense, mature hummock grasslands across arid Australia. For over a century, the species was presumed extinct, with no verified live sightings between 1912 and 1990. In 2013, wildlife photographer John Young captured confirmed footage and photographs of a live bird in Western Queensland, triggering targeted field research using acoustic recorders. Australian Wildlife Conservancy scientists have since identified small, highly vulnerable populations surviving in isolated desert pockets. Across millions of square kilometers of desert, its total habitat footprint consists of fragile, scattered patches of unburnt spinifex, a global rarity surviving in the vastness of the outback. The industrial tramway swallowed by the temperate forest. That straight, level bench cutting through dense, cool temperate rainforest along the Pieman or Gordon rivers in western Tasmania is not a hiking trail. It is an abandoned timber and mining tramway grade. Between the 1890s and 1930s, copper and timber companies constructed narrow-gauge railway lines deep into the dense rainforest to haul out Huon pine, King Billy pine, and rich mineral ores. Built with hand tools, timber trestles, and iron rails, these tramways spanned deep gorges and treacherous bogs to link remote mines like the North Mount Lyell operation with coastal ports. When mineral loads depleted and road transport took over, crews abandoned the lines and the dense rainforest reclaimed the corridor. In places like the West Coast Range, moss now covers rotting timber sleepers, rusted locomotive parts, and iron spikes buried beneath thick horizontal scrub. A national park jurisdiction larger than European nations. Glance at a map of Western Australia, and national parks appear as scattered green blocks across the landscape. Then consider the scale of Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory or Karlamilii National Park in Western Australia. Kakadu covers roughly 2 million hectares, nearly 20,000 square kilometers, making it roughly the size of Slovenia or half the size of Switzerland. Cartography covers over 1.2 million hectares of remote desert terrain. These massive jurisdictions do not simply protect isolated scenic peaks, they encompass entire river catchments, complete ecological systems, and continuous First Nations cultural landscapes held under native title. Driving across Kakadu from south to north covers over 200 kilometers without leaving park boundaries. The public estate that pays its own way. In most international jurisdictions, public conservation lands represent a significant net drain on local government tax bases. In Australia, public land management across national parks, state forests, and crown reserves operates under unique fiscal mechanisms. State governments provide direct funding for bushfire management, pest control, and infrastructure maintenance across millions of hectares of public land. Through bodies like the NSW National Parks and Wildlife Service and Parks Victoria, regional economies receive targeted funding that flows directly into regional towns for road maintenance, emergency services, and weed eradication programs. In regional local government areas where public land covers over 50% of the Shire, state infrastructure funding and park management operations represent the single largest economic stabiliser, the dead inland sea that comes back to life. The vast salt pans of Catithander Lake Eyre in South Australia look eternally dead. A dry, blinding crust of sodium chloride stretching over 9,500 square kilometres, sitting 15 metres below sea level. For years at a time, it remains a barren salt desert. But when monsoon rains fall thousands of kilometres to the north in tropical Queensland, water flows down the Georgina, Diamantina, and Cooper Creek catchments into the Channel Country. Over months, this floodwater travels across flat river basins, eventually spilling into Catithander. A full filling event occurs roughly a few times per century, transforming the dry salt floor into Australia's largest inland lake. Within weeks, millions of migratory waterbirds, including Australian pelicans and banded stilts, arrive to nest, while dormant brine shrimp eggs hatch in the brackish water. Then, under the desert sun, the water evaporates, returning the lake to a sterile salt pan. The border you cross without ever knowing it. Drive north on the Stuart Highway across the red dirt plain between Marla and Colgera, and at an unmarked point on the asphalt, you cross an invisible threshold. It is the 26th parallel of south latitude, the border separating South Australia from the Northern Territory. Drawn in London in the 19th century using astronomical calculations, the line has no physical presence, no customs gate, and no topographic ridge to mark its existence. Yet cross it, and the entire statutory framework governing the soil changes instantly. Crown land tenure, pastoral lease conditions, mining royalty rates, and native title administration all shift from South Australian state jurisdiction to Commonwealth and Northern Territory law. For station managers, mining companies, and traditional owner land councils, this invisible line dictates water allocation rights, mineral exploration permits, and environmental compliance frameworks. The student who rewrote Deep Time in the Pilbara. In the late 20th century, geologists broadly held that complex biological structures could not have survived in the Earth's earliest rock records. That assumption fractured in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. Research near Marble Bar by geologists including Malcolm Walter and Donald Lowe identified fossilized stromatolites, layered structures built by photosynthesizing cyanobacteria, preserved in the 3.48 billion-year-old Dresser Formation. Later, analysis of zircons from the nearby Jack Hills pushed the record of terrestrial water and continental crust back to 4.4 billion years, within a hair's breadth of the planet's formation. Microscopic mineral grains and fossilized bacterial mats, exposed in ordinary weathered outcrops beside cattle station tracks, changed global evolutionary timeline models. The erased town that vanished from the map. Drive through the Hamersley Range along the Fortescue Valley, and you will find a place where an entire town was systematically erased from public geography. Wittenoom was once a bustling mining community servicing the crucidolite, blue asbestos, mine in Wittenoom Gorge, producing thousands of tons of fibre between 1943 and 1966. Following definitive medical proof linking crucidolite exposure to fatal mesothelioma, the mine closed. The contamination was so widespread across the gorge and township that the Western Australian government took unprecedented legal steps. In 2007, the town was formally degazetted, removed from official road signs, excised from government maps, and disconnected from the electricity grid. In 2022, the state parliament passed dedicated legislation to compulsorily acquire remaining private properties and demolish all structures, returning a township township that once held over 1,000 residents to official blank space, the population living inside an ancient impact structure. Look at a regional satellite image of South Australia's Gawler Ranges, and the landscape appears as an ordinary mosaic of salt lakes and sheep stations. Gravity and aeromagnetic surveys conducted by Geoscience Australia tell a vastly different story. Beneath Lake Acraman lies an ancient impact structure, roughly 90 kilometers in diameter, created when a massive asteroid struck the Earth approximately 590 million years ago. The impact was so colossal that shattered rock fragments, ejecta, were blasted hundreds of kilometers eastward, forming a distinct, razor-thin geological layer embedded in the shale cliffs of the Flinders Ranges. Pastoralists running sheep, road crews grading dirt tracks, and remote homesteads sit directly inside the eroded ring of one of the largest impact structures on the continent. The continent hidden beneath the sea. We end where the continent itself appears to end, with the fundamental question of where Australia actually begins and terminates. Every map sheet taught in schools presents Australia as an isolated island continent bounded cleanly by its present-day coastline. Marine geophysics, multi-beam bathymetry, and seismic